Hi, this is Margaret Byrd and welcome to Color Quest and welcome to Goodwill. Today we are going to go shopping to set up a dye studio, or at least the best we can do in one shopping trip to Goodwill. The point of this video is purely to show you what you need in your dye studio, at least at the very minimum, and to encourage you, A, not to use your cooking ware at home, and B, to repurpose gently loved cookware that you may find at a thrift store like Goodwill. It just makes good economic sense for yourself as well as giving back to your community. So let's go do some shopping, see what we can find. Treasured list of a dye studio. So if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that most of my work in my dye studio actually happens here in my kitchen. And it's true that working with natural color really is about cooking color. It seems so logical to go ahead and use your cooking utensils and your pots and pans and things like that. However, that is not suggested. Although many of the things you may be using in your natural dye studio are in fact, for example, food to create dyes, many are not. And therefore it's just best practice for you to separate your cooking utensils that you use for day to day from the cooking utensils you're going to use in your dye studio. So either repurposing from your own kitchen. Once you use it for your dye studio, don't ever bring it back into your food prep space, or repurpose from a place like Goodwill. We're going to look at 12 or 13 different things that I would recommend that you're going to want to start in your dye studio, all of which, or most of which, are used for food prep. So, number one on the list is your dye pot with lid. This is going to be an essential piece of equipment for you to invest in. There are several types of pots that you can use in natural dyeing, one of which is stainless steel. Stainless steel is non-reactive, which means it's not going to interact with the dye matter that's in it. The same can be said for enamel pots or ceramic pots, both used in natural dyeing very commonly. However, you can also use aluminum pots or iron and copper pots. Those, however, could potentially have a mordant effect. All of those are metals, and as you know, mordants are metal salts that help with the bond between natural dye and fiber. Now, you might think, well, why not use those to get that extra mordant effect? And by all means, you can. However, if you want to start with more of a neutral and non-reactive pot, stick with stainless steel. It's a great option. You can find them out there in the world of thrift stores relatively easily. I have found all of my pots that way. All right, number two on the list. You're gonna recognize this one from almost all of my videos as well. This is a strainer, and you're gonna need a strainer no matter what. And I have a couple different kinds. I have this mesh strainer, which I love because the hole openings are very small. It allows you to remove dye matter that may be smaller in size. I also have a larger one, which is what I found in my local Goodwill this time, and that will work perfectly well too. If the size of the holes in your strainer are a little bit larger than what your dye matter is, then you can place a piece of muslin or cheesecloth into your strainer to help with that. So, strainer, key. Definitely get one of these that is not used for cooking. So number 3 is actually going to be 2 different items, these guys. I'm calling them spoons and tongs. I also happen to have this spatula type thing. You obviously are going to need these things to stir your dye, to pull out your fiber, or maybe pull out pieces of dye matter from your pot. One note, you will want to have more than one of at least the spoon and or spatula, for example, something to stir, because if you are using a iron modifier, if you're working with iron at all, you're gonna wanna keep those utensils separate. It's just best to keep that as your iron spoon. Have a couple different spoons, spatula, and at least one tong. Now, I have always wanted wooden spoons because they will beautifully age and take on color as you're dyeing, and I think that the effect is gorgeous. And then of course it'll be super easy to tell your wooden spoon that you're using for your natural dye studio. Number 4 is the incredibly useful and important measuring cup. Both of these have come in super handy for me in so many different ways. You can use them simply to pour water into your dye pot. Obviously, I have 2 different sizes here to measure. I have a 2 cup or 500 milliliter size, and I have a 4 cup / 1000 milliliter size or a liter size. I also have a 1 cup little baby. I really love the glass, but I happen to have this plastic one that was getting old and kind of yucky, so I retired it to my dye studio from the cooking side of my kitchen. You definitely will want to have a dedicated measuring cup. I also sometimes strain the dye right into this, just as a place to hold it if I'm moving dye from one place to the other. So measuring cups are super important and definitely worthwhile having in your first round of collecting materials for your dye studio. And related to measuring cups is measuring spoons. Now, I have all the different sizes, including even an 1/8 of a teaspoon. So I recommend that you have all of these because depending upon what you're using, you will use these different sizes. Again, very tempting just to use these for cooking and for dyeing. Throw them in the dishwasher, don't do it. Make these unique to your dye studio. Now, I wasn't able to find measuring spoons in Goodwill this time. We'll talk a little bit more about how you can build up your dye studio with a few different trips to Goodwill, which probably will happen anyway, as you find new things you want to add, and you definitely want to take advantage of their sale days. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, number 6 on the list is bowls. This is actually the bowl I use for iron. So this bowl doesn't really get used for anything other than that. So you're gonna wanna have a few bowls. I really like glass bowls. You are gonna be adding hot water, and I think it's just better all over the place for the environment. In all of my videos, I'm using bowls. I actually repurpose this for my own kitchen. However, I found several very inexpensive glass bowls at Goodwill this time, and I would say a minimum of 2, maybe 3 in different sizes, knowing that one is going to be used just for your iron. There are a lot of containers on this list. And number 7 is yet another one. That is what I'm calling a bin. I use these bins to soak things. I use these bins to catch things. If I'm pulling out fiber from my dye pot, I may pull it out over the bin so that it drips in the bin. They are so incredibly useful to have. You always have to wet your fiber before you dye. This is a great place to soak your fiber in prior. It's also wonderful if you're going to be doing dip dyeing and those kinds of things. So having a bin that's dedicated for that is a great way to go. And yet another container, the good old-fashioned mason jar. So I am using these, again, almost in every video. So you can get mason jars, they're super handy. Or I also just collect any glass jars that I use in my kitchen. These then become repurposed as ways to store dye. Just keeping your dye around and using it more than once, I think, is a great lesson in recycling, repurpose, you know, all that good stuff. One note you'll see is that I did have one of those amazing finds at Goodwill, and that is that I found a whole bunch of mason jars in the original packaging that happened to be donated, and I was able to pick up mason jars as well. They're just really pretty. Of course, I love using them in the videos. You never know, so keep an eye out when you go. You might find the little treasure that I found, new or even repurposed mason jars available at your local thrift store. Now, handling your dye matter, whether it be food or something that you are foraging for, you are going to need to make it smaller when you put it into the dye pot for various reasons. One being is that having smaller pieces encourages more surface area where you may be able to draw more color from. So you're gonna need scissors and a knife. You know what I'm gonna say, don't use a knife that you use for cutting your food. So you will want some way to cut things up. You may be able to get by with just using scissors. However, certain things are just easier done with a knife. I do most of my chopping with one of these two things. Which leads me to 10, and that is a cutting board. You will want to have a cutting board as well. You're not always going to use it, but it's extremely useful to have one that is dedicated for dye matter. So you don't have to worry if you're cutting onion skins or dahlia flower heads. Having a cutting board is just incredibly useful. So these guys will be important for you. All right, number 11. I was not able to find this in my trip to Goodwill. Now, I would say that a scale is something that in the beginning you can get away without, but as you begin to dive deeper into natural dyeing, you're going to want a scale, because we talk about the dye matter versus the weight of dry fiber as a ratio in order to determine how much dye matter you need for a certain amount of fiber. It'd be great to be able to find a scale in a thrift shop so it's a little less expensive, but the scale is something that if you were going to invest in something that's a little bit more expensive that you can't find in your local thrift store, a scale would be one place that I would say would be worth saving for. I think though, if you just keep an eye out, you'll be able to find it out there. It's definitely something that you're gonna want eventually. And last on the list is the obvious need in your dye studio for fiber. You know there are so many different fiber options, but going to a thrift store, you can repurpose fiber in the ways of using sheets or pillowcases or even clothes that you might find. And I was able to find quite a few things at the thrift store that I could use to dye. So know that you can use repurposed fiber as well. If you can check the tag and try to use fiber that is 100% natural, you will always be better off in your natural dye studio. And finally, there are a few things that is just useful to have around. A pair of rubber gloves is going to be a great thing to have around. I use these gloves again and again and again. They're the nitrile style very inexpensive. I wash my hands with them on, remove the glove, and then use it again. I use this when I'm handling iron. You may decide you want to use it to protect your hands from coloring, if you're working with indigo, for example, or just because you have sensitive skin. So having a set of gloves that you can use specifically for natural dyeing may be useful to you. The other thing you might want to get is some clothespins. I also have a drying line, which will be extremely useful. You can use a drying rack. Sometimes I just throw things over chairs. You may want a drop cloth if you are using something that you're worried about getting onto your floor. I also have pH strips. This starts to get a little more technical. It's not absolutely required. Eventually down the road, you might want to invest in having some pH strips so you can see about shifting or modifying the pH and changing colors in your dye pot. And definitely important is get yourself some stickers or some way to label. You will think you're gonna remember what you put in that mason jar, but trust me, when you start to accumulate all the dyes, you will forget which is which, and they start to look a lot alike. So that's just another suggestion, and these are little sundries that would be helpful. Absolutely not necessary, but you probably have those things, at least some of those things anyway, in your home. And since you're not consuming them via eating, it's probably okay to be able to use those things in your dye studio. Those are the 13 plus items that I would recommend everyone have in their first dye studio. I use all of these things. Now I'm going to go tally up the bill to see what it would cost today to buy these things if you are going to use a thrift store as a sourcing place. And one note, my local Goodwill has Saturdays and Sundays where a certain color tag is 50% off. And on Thursdays and Fridays, it's 30% off. So find out from your local store when they have those special sale days and shop on those days. I'm gonna go ahead and calculate the pricing based upon a 50% savings. What do you think that number is gonna be? Let's go find out. Okay, any guesses out there? I will tell you, this one time I came up with a grand total of $61.93 without the 50-cent discount, which brought me down to $30.96, excluding tax. Obviously, that's going to differ depending upon where you live. So around $31. I included 4 pieces of fiber in that, each at $1.99. And I also obviously included those mason jars, although that could be free if you repurpose your own glass jars that you're using in your kitchen. And I was unable to find measuring spoons. However, the other spoons and so forth that I got were 69 cents a piece. Half of that, bringing it down to about 35 cents. I'm guessing if I wanted to pick up a few measuring spoons, they would be in that same ballpark. The other thing that was not included was a knife, which I was unable to find, but I did find scissors, which could be used. You can always break things with your hands. And a scale I couldn't find. So that would be something I would keep looking for, or potentially investing new for that. And again, the scale is something you're gonna want eventually as you become addicted to this thing called natural dyeing, which will happen. So if we're looking at approximately $30 to be able to start a dye studio, maybe even as low as $25, to be able to have the utensils you're gonna need without borrowing from your kitchen and by repurposing through a thrift store. Now, of course, you can retire some of your cookware. That's what I've done as well. So if it's time to get a new pot or pan for cooking, why not keep that old pot and use it for dye purposes? So, up to you, but that's not a bad investment to get started in something so amazing as natural dyeing. Of course, as you forage and learn more about where natural color may come from, you will find that those sources may in fact be free as well. know that it doesn't have to be anything fancy, and you can get by with just a little bit of an investment so that you have your own dye equipment ready to go. All right, are you excited to go out there and do a little thrifting? I have added over the course of many years. Now I have, I think, about 6 or 7 dye pots in various sizes, but I started with just one, and it's amazing to see how I've been able to build up my studio over the course of time. Next week on Color Quest, I would like to go back to a wonderful care package that I received from one of our viewers here on Color Quest, Marilyn from Florida, who gave me stevia. Now, she says that she has gotten green from stevia. So, you know me and green, I'm pretty curious about that. And if the spring sprouts are kind to me, I'm gonna go out and do a little foraging and see if I can't find some nettle. You know, I never got green really last year from nettle, but maybe these young spring nettles will do me a favor and bring some green into my dye pot. Don't know, we'll see. So join me next week as we invite green back into our dye studio. If you missed last week's video and you're watching this the Friday before the Easter holiday, I dyed Easter eggs with all natural materials. So go back and check that video out. It's a lot of fun, and the results I think were so beautiful. Happy spring/fall in a shift of season wherever you may be, and I'll see you next Friday. Number three and four. Numbers 3 and 4 are actually these guys. Now,